From Madrid, Spain, this is Democracy Now!
25 years of negotiations, and every year we hit the records in heat waves, in temperature increase, and emissions. So something is not working here, but civil society around the world is waking up. We are waking up from Santiago to Madrid and to the world to confront the climate crisis.
Students across the globe are walking out of classes today in another round of climate strikes. A major march is set for here in Madrid tonight, the site of the UN Climate Summit. We'll speak to climate strikers from Uganda and Chile, as well as one of the organizers of the Alternative Climate Summit that opens Saturday here in Madrid. It's called Cumbre Social. Then we'll look at how some of Spain's largest polluters are sponsoring the UN Climate Summit.
I think Iberdrola and Endesa, these two big Spanish gas utilities, have both paid €2 million to become what are called diamond sponsors of COP25. But what's shocking is that the Spanish government, in fact, approached these companies to have them sponsor and then gave them a 90% tax break for their sponsorship. And this allows these companies to hide the fact that their emissions are causing runaway climate change.
All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. We're broadcasting from Madrid, Spain for the next week during the UN Climate Summit. In a historic step, House Speaker Nancy Pelosi has instructed the chairs of key House committees to begin drafting articles of impeachment against President Trump. Pelosi said Trump's actions to seek foreign help in the 2020 election strikes at the very heart of the Constitution.
Our democracy is what is at stake. The president leaves us no choice but to act because he is trying to corrupt, once again, the election for his own benefit. The president has engaged in abuse of power, undermining our national security and jeopardizing the integrity of our elections. His actions are in defiance of the vision of our founders and the oath of office that he takes to preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States.
House Speaker Nancy Pelosi's announcement sets the stage for a full House vote on impeachment that could take place before Christmas. Hours after making her announcement, Pelosi was asked by a reporter at a news conference if she hates President Trump.
This is about the Constitution of the United States and the facts that lead to the president's violation of his oath of office. And as a Catholic, I resent your using the word hate in a sentence that addresses me. I don't hate anyone. I was raised in a way that is a heart full of love and always prayed for the president. And I still pray for the president. I pray for the president all the time. So don't mess with me when it comes to words like that.
House Speaker Pelosi's actions come as the House Judiciary Committee says it will convene another hearing Monday to allow lawyers to formally present evidence in the impeachment inquiry, which centers on how President Trump withheld military aid to Ukraine in order to pressure the Ukrainian president to investigate Trump's political rival, Joe Biden, and his son, Hunter. Presidential candidate and former Vice President Joe Biden lashed out at a town hall in Iowa Thursday after an audience member suggested Biden helped his son Hunter get a lucrative job in Ukraine. Hunter Biden had been on the board of Ukrainian gas company Burisma, and the Republicans have been spreading debunked conspiracy theories about Hunter's position. This is a retired farmer from Iowa.
But you, on the other hand, sent your son over there to get a job and work for a gas company that he had no experience with gas or nothing, in order to get access for the president. So you're selling access to the president just like he was.
So you're a damn liar, man. That's not true. And no one has ever said that? No one has heard that?
I see it on the TV.
You see it on the TV? No, I know you do. And by the way, that's why I'm not sedentary. I get up and no, let him go.
And that was former Vice President Joe Biden lashing out at the town hall in Iowa Thursday. The Pentagon's considering sending thousands more troops to the Middle East to counter Iran. The Wall Street Journal reports up to 14,000 more U.S. troops could be deployed. The potential deployment comes as the United States claims Iran has transferred short-range missiles into Iraq. Saudi Arabia has taken the world's most profitable company public. The state-owned oil giant Saudi Aramco raised a record $25.6 billion in its initial public offering. When trading begins, the company will be valued at $1.7 trillion, making it the most valuable listed company in the world. More than 140,000 people around the world died from measles last year, amidst a surge in the number of cases of the preventable disease, partially caused by misinformation about vaccines. The vast majority of the victims were children under the age of 5. The new figures come as the Pacific Island nation of Samoa has arrested an anti-vaccination campaigner amidst a massive outbreak of measles that's already killed over 60 people, mostly young children. At least 62 people have died after a boat capsized in the Atlantic Ocean off the coast of the West African nation of Mauritania. The boat was headed to Spain's Canary Islands. It was carrying over 150 refugees when it ran out of fuel and sank on Wednesday. A shocking video obtained by ProPublica shows the last hours of the life of the 16-year-old indigenous Guatemalan asylum seeker Carlos Gregorio Hernandez Vasquez. He was found dead by his cellmate in a Texas Border Patrol holding cell in May. A warning to our viewers, this footage is disturbing. Hernandez Vasquez has been diagnosed with the flu and a fever of 103 degrees when he was put in the holding cell with another sick boy. A nurse recommended he be sent to the emergency room if his conditions worsened. Instead, Border Patrol left him in a cold cement quarantine cell where he was found dead the following morning in a pool of blood next to a toilet. An agent checked on Hernandez Velasquez 3 times while the boy was dying. But ProPublica reports the Customs and Border Protection agent failed to perform adequate checks on the boy and never reported anything alarming with the boy's health status. The video also shows that CBP lied about how the boy's body was found. In France, hundreds of thousands of workers are continuing their strike today in protest of French President Emmanuel Macron's proposed pension plan. Over 800,000 people poured into the streets Thursday as the strike's first day shuttered schools across the country and canceled hundreds of trains and flights. This is French pensioner, former construction worker Michel Laurent.
Today I demonstrate for the next generation because when you see that we have worked all our lives, I've worked 43 years, I have a 1,200 euros pension. I doubt that younger people will have a pension like we currently have. If they want it, they will have to work until they are 70 years old. It is untenable.
Uber says it's received over 3,000 reports of sexual assault in the United States last year. The Wall Street-backed ride-hailing app has repeatedly been criticized for not taking passenger safety seriously and for ignoring reports of rape and sexual assault by its drivers. Regulators in London have refused to renew Uber's license to operate in the city, citing several breaches that place passengers and their safety at risk. Uber can still operate in London while it appeals the decision. The Guardian reveals Congresswoman Ilhan Omar of Minnesota and Rashida Tlaib of Michigan were targeted by a mysterious Israeli-based Facebook group and a far-right campaign to spread misinformation and Islamophobic attacks against the 2 congresswomen. Ilhan Omar and Rashida Tlaib are the first 2 Muslim women to serve in Congress. They've been subject to racist insults from President Trump and Islamophobic rants from Trump supporters and other political opponents. They have both also received violent death threats. A retired New York police officer has revealed the police department's Transit District 34 in Brooklyn, New York, encouraged officers to arrest Black and Latino men in exchange for rewards. The testimony is part of a discrimination lawsuit filed by Sergeant Edwin Raymond and 3 other officers who say they were forced to apprehend more Black and Latino men than other racial and ethnic groups. The former officer, Pierre Maximilian, also said Asian, Jewish, and white people who were referred to as soft targets were not to be cuffed, and that all officers in that district are required to fill a, quote, collar quota. Maximilian retired in 2015 after being retaliated against for not following these orders. Nearly 700,000 people are poised to lose access to food stamps after the Trump administration gave its final approval to a rule change proposed by the Agriculture Department. The Trump administration gave its stamp of approval despite receiving over 140,000 letters opposing the highly unpopular rule change in recent months. The University of North Carolina is facing student and faculty protests after the school secretly agreed to provide $2.5 million to a neo-Confederate organization to preserve and display a Confederate statue known as Silent Sam. Last year, anti-racist protesters toppled the statue, which had stood on the UNC Chapel Hill campus for over a century. Critics are accusing the school of helping to subsidize white nationalists. And Nigerian secret police have rearrested the prominent Nigerian-American journalist and activist Omoyele Sowore just hours after he was released on bail after 4 months in detention. Sowore is a former presidential candidate in Nigeria and the founder of the New York-based news outlet Sahara Reporters. Showore's co-defendant, Olowale Bakari, was also released on Thursday and then rearrested today. Amnesty International recently declared both men to be prisoners of conscience. To see our interviews with Sowore Omoyele and his family, go to democracynow.org. And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. We're broadcasting from Madrid, Spain, where the United Nations Climate Change Conference, known as COP25, began Monday and will continue through next week as environmental leaders from around the world gather to negotiate global solutions to the climate crisis. The summit was supposed to be held in Santiago, Chile, but the country's right-wing president, Sebastián Piñera, canceled the summit just over a month ago amidst massive protests against economic inequality and austerity. Spain's president, Pedro Sanchez, then offered to host the summit. Activists have converged in Madrid for the summit and are hosting an alternative summit of their own, Cumbre Social por el Clima, the social summit for the climate. The alternative summit has been organized by social justice and environmental groups to draw attention to the ongoing political repression in Chile, corporate influence on the climate summit, Spain's own failure to address the climate crisis, and the Eurocentrism of the climate conference, which is being held in Europe for the third year in a row. The alternative summit begins Saturday morning, that's tomorrow, at the University of Madrid, and will kick off tonight with a climate march through the city center. We're broadcasting from the convergence space that activists are using as a hub for their organizing. It's a union hall and former monastery that today is covered in colorful protest art and bustling with organizers that have pulled the alternative summit together with only a few months' notice. So we're right here in the Cumbre Social, in the social summit for the climate, with one of the organizers, Tom Koongharts. He's a journalist and activist with Ecologists in Action. It's great to be with you. Welcome to Democracy Now! Tom, as we sit here, this place is surrounded by posters. Maybe we can do a broad view of the walls. It says Plaza de los Pueblos, the Plaza of the People, Salvemos la Tierra, Save the Earth, as well. Let's decolonize.
That is a very important issue. We have a huge historic debt with millions of people who were slaved from Africa to America and never have been justice about that. So the issue of anti-racism and anti-colonism is very important for the march also today at 6 in the afternoon. So hopefully thousands of people will be gathering in this very important march.
So tell us about this place that we're in. It is a former monastery?
Yes, it was built more than 400 years ago, but it was a trade union's building since the 80s. And fortunately, the trade unions UGT said we can have it for 2 weeks to make gatherings, assemblies, and prepare the march and actions of the different groups who are involved in the preparation of the activities these 2 weeks, like Fridays for Future, Extinction Rebellion, and many environmental and human rights groups, trade unionists, and many international solidarity groups also fighting all around the world for justice, both environmental and social justice.
So tell us about this social summit for the climate, where it will be held, from the university to here to where else, and talk about the 850 groups who organize this space in a very short period of time since you guys just got the summit a few months ago.
Actually, the social summit was organized in less than 4 weeks, and first of all, it's a solidarity action with the people in Chile, with all the people in the world who are suffering crimes against humanity, who are suffering repression, who are suffering the crimes of transnational corporation and corrupt states who are only doing business and doing politics in favor of a very small minority, which are the big businesses, who are also gathering here in the official climate summit. So it's a complete unjust world. We have heard that in your news at the beginning. And also in Spain, we have a huge situation of injustice, unemployment. So for us, the issues of social injustice, the problem of corruption, the problem of huge economic and social and environmental crises all over the world brings us together, social movements, trade unions, environmental groups, but also social justice groups from all over the world. And it's first of all a denouncement also of the repression of the right-wing government of Chile against the people in Chile. And that is very important for us. We are very connected with the movement in Santiago de Chile. And today the march actually will be at the same time as a march in Santiago de Chile. We will marching together, and we are connecting also with the organizers of the civil society space held at the same time in Santiago de Chile, also criticizing the farce and the theater is done in the official summit, because they are not the solution to the huge climate emergency. We, the people, are the solution.
So talk about how Spain ended up getting the UN Climate Summit. I mean, you have, originally it was Brazil, and the far-right president, when he was elected, when his first action office, canceled the COP. Then Chile took it. Then because of those protests, the right-wing president there canceled it. And President Sanchez of Spain picked this up very quickly. Talk about the significance for him and now the right-wing government that runs Madrid, what it means for them, who actually campaigned against climate regulations. It's major campaign focus in the last weeks.
Exactly. So we should know that Spain is one of the European countries which is most responsible for the increase of greenhouse gas emissions over the past decades. So Spain has a huge ecological and historical debt with the global south, completely depending on imports of fossil fuels. And the big transnational corporations from Spain are committing crimes and human rights violation all the time and are very responsible for the natural destructions all over the world. So Spain is very responsible for the climate emergency, and we have had social democratic governments and conservative right-wing governments who are very irresponsible. They were not caring sufficiently about the climate emergency, and even if they bring the official climate summit from the UN here to Madrid, it was a kind of political shift to help them to get some votes towards the last elections we had very recently on the 10th of November. Actually, the Spanish social democratic governments have shown in the last year that they were not increasing their willingness to fight climate emergency. They are not really willing to change the economic and also energy policy in Spain, and that needs also a completely shift, a paradigm shift of the development model in Europe, which is completely irresponsible and a root cause of the climate emergency all over the world. That's why we are feeling that it's a greenwashing both of the national, very grey and dark fossil fuel policies of the Spanish government. It's a greenwashing of the right-wing government in Madrid, because only some months ago, this Madrid mayor from the right-wing party, who was denying climate change, who was saying he will eliminate all the environmental policies which the municipal left-wing government put in place only some months ago, like a low emission scheme to try to stop entering many cars into the Madrid center. We should know that Spain is one of the most polluting countries also in the world. I mean, we have nearly 40,000 people who are dying, so we have premature deaths, 40,000 a year. That means in Madrid it's about more than 3,000 people dying prematurely because of the air contamination, and that is mostly because of these huge traffic. So we have unsustainable transport systems.
So you have the previous mayor, Manuela Carmena, a socialist mayor, who pushed forward the Madrid Central, right, this low-emission zone,
Exactly.
so you don't have this mass traffic jam all day.
We still have them, unfortunately.
As much. And then you have the new mayor, Almeida,
yes.
who actually made his total campaign about getting rid of these restrictions.
Exactly. And just before the climate summit, he says that is the best thing he has ever done. So now he's trying to greenwash completely his very unresponsible campaign he did. And actually, the Popular Party is very responsible to filling the most polluting companies in Spain with public money. That's why Spain gives hundreds and thousands of millions of euros to the energy companies, to the oil companies, to the gas companies over the last years. And that's why we have a real problem that is very difficult to get out of this fossil fuel industry right now.
You stopped, Ecologists in Action, your group, stopped the mayor from getting rid of the low emission zone?
Not alone. We have a very interesting platform created of many people here in the city center. So there are dozens of organizations involved in the platform to defend Madrid Central. And it was a collective work, and tens of thousands of people pulled into the streets in summer just after the local elections to ask to not eliminate Madrid Central, this low emission scheme. And that is very linked to fight for climate justice, not only in Spain, but over the whole world. That's why those people who are fighting to get Madrid rid of car traffic and air contamination is also fighting together with many people in the world against air contamination, but the whole silly system of putting public money into the car industry and the oil industry, which then are also very responsible for the mining and human rights violation all over the world. We have that in the Middle East and also Latin America.
Talk about nationally. We've just arrived in Madrid from Stockholm, and the president the prime minister won a snap election recently, Pedro Sanchez, and he's in the midst of negotiating with Podemos.
Unidas Podemos, which is Izquierda Unida and Podemos together.
But talk about the role and the increasing power of the extreme right group Vox and how that plays in here, whether we're talking about the environment or gender violence.
Well, the extreme right party is coming out actually of the split of the right-wing scheme, which was the Popular Party, because there's a huge problem of impunity in Spain. So the crimes against humanity committed by Spanish fascism of the Franco dictatorship was never being judged. And we have still hundreds of thousands of people in graves all over Spain, and people are looking for their bodies of their families. So that is a very unjust system. And still from this, we have a very fascist legacy in the juridical system, in the political system. But because of the corruption scandals, because the right-wing Popular Party of Spain is one of the most corrupted party in the world, the right-wing political party split it up to neoliberal Ciudadanos, to Vox, the extreme right, and still the PP is the Popular Party. So there is also a growing voting towards this extreme right party, which is very dangerous and very similar to things happening with Trump in the US, with Salvini in Italy, or Le Pen in France, or Alternative für Deutschland in Germany. So this is a very dangerous thing because it's giving oxygen to the right-wing groups trying to make attacks on migrants, on refugees, and maybe there is a new fear towards these very extreme fascist groups to make attacks against migrants, like we had this attack with a bomb this week.
A grenade was just thrown into a residential center of mainly unaccompanied minors, refugees from other countries, and also orphans here in Spain.
Yeah, that is an attack which we can explain that there is a growing institutional racism which is legitimized both by the right-wing Popular Party and the Social Democrats, because unfortunately the Social Democratic governments is talking about human rights in the official climate summit, but at the end they are responsible for migration policies which brings the deaths of thousands of people in the Mediterranean Sea. You just mentioned the example in Mauritania, migrants and refugees trying to get to the Canary Islands.
62 people dying.
Exactly,
yesterday.
and that is happening all the time.
As they tried to make it to what is
to Spain,
Spain's
exactly.
Canary Islands.
But that is happening all the time because the Spanish government, together with the European Union, are pulling hundreds of millions of public money to finance the militaries and the police in Morocco, in Libya, and also Turkey to stop refugees and migrants getting to Europe, and then they're responsible for these very criminal policies which makes people dying all the time in the Mediterranean Sea. That's why we are talking about one of the biggest mass graves in the world. So very similar to the very criminal migration policies of Trump in the Mexican border.
Tom, very quickly, we only have about 30 seconds, but we started by you talking about decolonization and how that relates to climate. I'm sitting in front of a big sign that you have here at the Cumbra, at this social summit for the climate, that says, "Let's decolonize." Explain that more fully.
Let's decolonize means there is a deep historic impunity of the crimes committed by Europe in colonial time, both with the slave trade, but also with the assassination of millions of indigenous people in America. And these historical crimes against humanity was never being judged, and this is still impune, and we will not accept it. That's why for us it's so important that indigenous people, migrant and refugees are in the forefront of the demonstration today at 6, but those indigenous communities and the frontline communities are all over the world also fight against fossil fuels, mega projects of the same Spanish and European transnational corporation who are financing the official climate summit. So this is a completely unjust policies, and unfortunately, the European Union and the Spanish Social Democratic government are very responsible for those very unjust situations.
Well, Tom Kuhars, journalist, activist with Ecologists in Action, one of the leading environmental groups organizing the Alternative Climate Summit. Thanks so much for welcoming us into your space, rapidly put together in the last few weeks since Spain took on the UN Climate Summit. When we come back, we'll be joined by 2 Fridays for Future youth activists from Chile and Uganda who are here in Madrid for the UN Summit. They'll join activists from around the world today in the climate march. Stay with us.
Thank you.
With so many bills to pay, there is no conceivable way to save for a rainy day. In this country of voraciousness, to be precise, is why every damn thing so overpriced. Businessman making everybody feel. Government give them a open license to steal. If you think I lie, one nylon panty is $19.90. $20 for some baby milk. Around that jersey is $260. $300 and change a yard for silk. It hard, Lord, I feel inside. Oh Lord, capitalism gone mad. They fleece in the public bird. Put a hand, Lord, capitalism gone mad. Is bribery a pack of cigarette. Just leave you with a hole in your wallet.
This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. We're broadcasting live from Madrid, Spain, as the second week of the UN Climate Summit begins. In September, Madrid City Hall announced it'll roll back plans to restrict traffic in the city's central low-emission zone amid protests from a conservative and center-right coalition. The initial plan, known as Madrid Central, was introduced by the former leftist mayor Manuela Carmena. We walked over to the social media summit that we are here in today to meet with people who are going to be out on the streets in just a matter of a few hours as thousands of people are planning this first major march in Brazil, in Madrid, around the UN Climate Summit. That's right. Students across the globe have been walking out of classes today in another round of climate strikes. Here in Spain, the 16-year-old Swedish climate activist Greta Thunberg has arrived in Madrid to take part in today's strike, as well as a major march set for 6 p.m. local time. Greta began the climate strike movement last year when she started skipping school every Friday to stand in front of the Swedish parliament, demanding action to prevent catastrophic climate change. Her protests spread, quickly going global. Greta was mobbed by reporters earlier today as she arrived in Madrid on a train from Portugal. On Tuesday, Greta arrived in Lisbon, Portugal, after traveling for 3 weeks across the Atlantic in a 48-foot catamaran, refusing to fly because of the high carbon footprint of air travel. So we're joined now by two youth climate strikers. Hilda Flavia Nakabuye is the founder of Fridays for Future Uganda, and Angela Valenzuela is a coordinator with Fridays for Future in Chile, where this year's UN Climate Summit was scheduled to be until mass protests against neoliberalism forced the Chilean government to cancel the talks. Hilda and Angela, we welcome you to Democracy Now! Hilda, you just came from meeting with Greta Thunberg?
Yep.
And you've come all the way from Uganda for this. Talk about Fridays for Future Uganda and why this is such an important issue to you.
Fridays for Future in Uganda started in February, and we were just two strikers, but now it's a very big movement. We have around 25,000 people striking for the global climate strikes, and it is a very important issue for us because it's us against our future. We either do something now or we don't have a future.
So talk about the effects of the climate crisis in Uganda.
The effects of the climate crisis in Uganda are visible, and we face that every day. We have so much floods that are killing people. Recently, there were so heavy rainfalls, and very many people died because of that. There has been rising temperatures in the past few months in Uganda that dried people's plantations because agriculture is the backbone of Uganda, and people were going hungry.
Who are the biggest contributors to the climate crisis, do you think, in Uganda? And who are you trying to hold accountable there? And is it inside the country or elsewhere?
I think it is both in and outside. We as people in Uganda should be responsible for our actions and activities, because some of the activities that are done in Uganda also contribute to the effects of climate change. We are aware that most of the effects of the climate change are from other European countries because we contribute very little percentage to the effects. But I think it's also our responsibility as people in Uganda to take on the action.
Angela, you've just come from Chile. Now, it's so interesting as this march is about to take place here in Spain. If there's going to be a simultaneous march in Chile. So you were going to host the UN Climate Summit there, but then the protests led to its cancellation. Talk about the significance of this.
Well, so as Fridays for Future as well in Chile, we have been mobilizing for the whole year and hoping that people in Chile will wake up And it's very inspiring to see like the whole movement that has started since October for the social crisis. And people woke up, and that's very inspiring. But at the same time, it's terrifying to see how we're getting all the repression from the state and human rights violations that are happening until today. So I think partly it was like a very strategic move to change the COP from Santiago to Madrid, because since it was suspended in Chile, the international mainstream media is not really talking about Chile anymore. And now it's been shocking for me to participate at COP and going inside and seeing all the greenwashing that I already knew that it was going to happen, but now it's also about human rights. And the speech that Sebastián Piñera sent in a video for the first day at COP was terrible. He was saying that
Chilean President Piñera, who canceled the COP in Chile.
Exactly. And I think if COP was going to take place in Santiago, he was forced to listen to people and to hear their demands and try to solve the situation in a more democratic way. But he was not willing to do that. That's clear. And that's what's saddening. But at the same time, I feel that this needed to happen in Chile. And it's really inspiring to see all people very empowered. And now we have the chance to write a new constitution from zero to get rid of Pinochet's constitution. So that's very meaningful, and we are achieving more than we thought we could, like maybe 3 months ago.
Are you sorry he canceled the COP? Were you shocked when he announced it? I mean, you had hundreds of thousands of people in the streets protesting austerity, protesting inequality. He canceled both the APEC summit, the Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation Summit, and the COP.
I had mixed feelings. I still don't have like one position, because from one side is like you see how people is empowered and they can like take down 2 massive projects that the government had and had been planning for a long time that were very meaningful. So people felt really like empowered that they could have that impact. At the other side, like I come from the social, like the environmental movement. So we had been like pushing for this like awareness and this movement for the whole year. So it was a shock, and we all felt like this bad impression of the decision, understanding that Sebastián, like our president, was not willing to listen to people and to have an open dialogue, because COP will like hopefully had like the opportunity to open different space, like the social summit that is still happening in Santiago, and so many other places.
Explain that, because here the UN Climate Summit, the social summit for the climate, is starting tomorrow. You're also having an alternative climate summit in Chile anyway, right? In Santiago.
Yeah, and it's we are responding to the social context. So, for example, it was supposed to be focused on the climate crisis, but we're embracing everything that's like been the debate for the last 2 months in Chile. So now that we have the chance for writing a new constitution and voting for it in April, now this climate summit is also like a space for debate on how to include like shifting our paradigm in this new constitution, and how like the social demands, that is like basic access to education, healthcare, pension systems that dignify people's life, and minimum wage, and those very basic human rights can be sustained by a paradigm shift and like a new model that is not pushing people to its limits, and also it's leading us to a climate breakdown.
So talk about the links between climate catastrophe and human rights violations in Chile. For example, the indigenous Mapuche people and what people are facing.
Yeah, can you repeat the question?
Talk about the connection between the climate catastrophe that we are all facing, the climate crisis, and human rights violations in Chile, particularly around the rights, for example, of indigenous people like the Mapuche.
Yeah, well, in Chile, the Mapuche, like for centuries, have been like facing the oppression of the state and human rights violations, and I think we have to learn from them in order to cope with the climate crisis. They have a different paradigm, they have answers that we need to look at and respect. And if you see in the protests, what's been super interesting is that there are many flags with the indigenous, like Mapuche flag, more than Chilean flags. So that's a sign that we need to redefine our culture, and we are like looking back into our roots for answers. So that's super inspiring. And then I wanted also to touch on like the human rights violations that are tied with the climate crisis and the fossil fuel industry, because something that's very huge in Chile is that we have sacrifice zones. So these are communities that are forced to live right next to coal plants, and that this is one of the issues that we have been bringing throughout the year with the social and environmental movements. And we are demanding that they close down coal plants by 2030, all 28 coal plants. And I guess it's just important to call attention that now, for example, ENGIE, that is one of the founders of COP25, is now retracting from investing into renewable energy and the plan for decarbonizing our energy system. Like justifying itself that now the economic crisis in Chile is coming, and etc. So,
in a moment, I want to talk to you about your connecting activism with the arts. But Hilda, I want to go to you in Uganda. If you can talk about some of your family background that inspired you to become a climate activist.
That is personal, but we, as my family in Uganda, were facing effects of climate change back then when I was still young. And we didn't know that what we were facing were the effects of climate change. And many people didn't know about that. And some people in Uganda still do not know that the effects they're facing are because of climate change. Because basically climate change is not really known in Uganda as it's not taught in schools. So we had a big plantation in the village, and me and my family used to travel to the village to like for parties and like Christmas season. So there was a lot of food then, but then after some time it kept on changing. The plantation started drying up.
Your grandmother was a farmer?
Yes, and my grandfather. So we had animals as well in the village, but when these effects of climate change started showing up, our lives became a bit very hard because we lacked food to eat. Plantations were washed away by the heavy rains, and sometimes we had like very little rainfall and a lot of sun. Temperatures were already increasing, so our wells started to dry up. So we couldn't get water and pasture for the animals to feed. So my grandparents sold off most of the land and part of the animals because we could not feed them anymore. And then life started to get hard because we could not find food and water. So sometime I had to go to school, but my dad couldn't find money to pay for the tuition because we couldn't have any more food to sell or any more animals left. So I had to sit down for 3 months while my friends were at school. And to me, climate change is a personal issue. It affects us.
And talk about how important it is for the UN Climate Summit, which for a few years now has been held in the North, in the global North, to hear the voices of the global South like yours.
It is really, I don't know what to say, but to me, as a person from the global South, I think it is right to be here, to speak to very many people, especially people in the global North, who are also part of the people that are really causing so much effects to the climate crisis. It is a very big issue for me to be here, and I feel like maybe there's hope that after this summit, maybe people will change the way they live, or people will have concrete actions towards this climate crisis.
And finally, this issue of arts and resistance, Angela. In our music break, we're going to play your song. Talk about it and where you plan to perform it, and why arts is a critical part of the resistance movement.
Yeah, I feel that, well, arts are fundamentals for us to understand the scope of the crisis and don't lose hope. Like it can heal us and inspire us. So we have had the scientific reports for years now telling us that climate change and the ecological breakdown, it's here. But art can really heal and nurture our resistance, I think. And I know that Extinction Rebellion has this like narrative culture, like as part of their action as well. So I really feel that this is key in order to continue in the long term for, like in this movement.
And explain Hombre de Papel.
Hombre de Papel. So I actually wrote it, like the name of the song, instead of Hombre de Papel, it was going to be Carbon Markets. But then I realized that it was not a good name because, well, of course I'm against the carbon markets. But so Hombre de Papel
means in English
man of paper. And it's actually singing to the delegates that are like writing all of these papers and agreements, and for years have been like writing down commitments that they are not achieving. They are not like actually transforming this into reality, because every year we hit records on emissions, and it's just also calling for the movement to become stronger and to raise our voice as like the tallest waterfall on earth, and then it comes with lots of metaphors.
Can you give us a few lines before we play that song? A few of, would you mind singing a few of the lines?
I would love to. So it's ¿Cuándo vas a aprender, hombre de papel? ¿Cuándo vas a entender que la vida no se puede vender?
Loica, that's your that's your nom de guerre, I guess you could say, your singing name. I want to thank you so much for being with us. Yes, Angela Valenzuela is a coordinator with Fridays for Future in Chile, and we want to thank Hilda Flavia Nakabue, who's come from Kampala, Uganda, as founder of the Fridays for Future in Uganda. This is Democracy Now! When we come back, we look at the anti-corporate movement taking on the UN COPs this year, COP25. We're broadcasting from Madrid, Spain. Stay with us.
Creyó delimitar el cielo, fraccionarlo para venderlo. Creyó apoderarse de la vida, abusarla, agotarla. ¿Cuándo vas a aprender, hombre de papel? ¿Cuándo vas a entender que la vida no se puede vender? Creyó delimitar el cielo en su soledad. Se equivoca.
Hombre de Papel, that's Man Man of Paper, sung and written by our guest, Angela Vanzuela. Her artistic name is Luika. She'll sing that song during a concert after the climate march today here in Madrid at COP25, the UN Climate Summit. That's right, Democracy Now! Is in Madrid for the next week and will be broadcasting throughout the week from inside and outside the UN Climate Summit, from the suites to the corporate suites to the summit floor. I'm Amy Goodman. A group of climate activists walked out of a panel at the UN Climate Summit, which began earlier this week here in Madrid on Thursday, to protest the presence of Shell, BP, and Chevron. Representatives from the oil companies were taking part in an event organized by the International Emissions Trading Association. Laurie Vanderberg of Friends of the Earth Netherlands took part in the walkout.
We don't think that polluters like Shell, like BP and like Chevron should be at the COP influencing the climate talks here. So we stood up, we covered our ears and we walked out of the room to make a point to say that Shell shouldn't be at the COP, Chevron shouldn't be at the COP, BP shouldn't be at the COP. They are wrecking our climate, and if we have these polluters here, we won't stay below 1.5 degrees.
This comes as the Spanish government is facing criticism for reaching out to Endesa, Spain's biggest polluter, to sponsor the UN climate talks. Our next guest has been organizing toxic tours of Madrid to expose the corporations and financiers driving the climate crisis. Pasco Sabido is a researcher and campaigner for the Corporate Europe Observatory. We welcome you back to Democracy Now!, Pasco.
Thank you.
It seems we see you almost every year at these UN climate summits, either in the streets or breaking up some side conference that's happening inside. Talk about this first action that you've engaged in.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's shocking, the fact that companies like Shell, BP and Chevron, the very same culprits that have been causing this climate crisis, and let's not forget, trashing communities and the environments everywhere they go, are here pretending to be part of the solution. And what we heard was equally shocking. I mean, they're trying to turn forests, ecosystems, nature into the new carbon markets. This is a disaster for all of us, especially when we want to keep temperature rises to a maximum of 1.5 degrees. This is just not feasible with their plans. So the action itself was quite symbolic. It was, we covered our ears, stood up, covered our ears, made sure we couldn't hear the rubbish that Shell was spouting, and then walked out. But this is not the only event that Shell's organising. It's involved in multiple events throughout this summit, and is just one of many examples of the sort of corporate involvement that we're seeing more and more of here.
Well, you've just come out with a report on the corporate sponsorship of the UN Climate Summit. Talk about what you found.
Indeed. So it came out today with corporate accountability, OMAL and Ecologistas en Acción. And it shows that, in fact, the biggest polluters are sponsoring these climate talks, from fossil fuel companies to the banks that finance them, as well as many others like airlines. And so, I mean, what we saw is, it's not just the biggest polluters who are using this for huge greenwashing opportunities. You'll see their logos all over the COP, but they're also using this to influence the talks themselves, to gain access to the negotiations through events, getting negotiations to come through events, through cocktail parties and other forms of privileged access. And this is, I mean, year after year. You said I've been here year after year, and the problem seems to get worse year after year, that we have these companies completely wrapping themselves in the colours of the UN, pretending to be green, whilst underneath their dirty reality is they're climate criminals. But also what we showed in this report is lots of these companies have been involved in huge human rights abuses and workers' abuses across Latin America, which I think underlines the neo-colonial nature of climate change and its colonial roots, because a lot of these companies from Spain are very active in ex-colonies in Latin America, keeping those relationships going.
We'll talk about the electric company co-sponsoring the summit and what that means. It's the largest greenhouse gas emitter in Spain?
Completely. So Endesa, which is it produces electricity from coal, gas and oil. It's Spain's single biggest polluter when it comes to emissions, and is involved in all sorts of terrible projects, and not just here in Spain, but also in Latin America. So it's involved in gas over there, gas production. Gas, in fact, it's little known, but is as bad for the climate as coal. It's also involved in big hydroelectric, which have led to huge indigenous rights abuses as well, and big accusations of corruption. But it's also joined by its fellow big electricity company, Iberdrola, which for the last few years has really been trying to give itself a green image. But We looked at in our report we came out with in 2018, it produced more electricity from fossil gas than it did from wind and solar combined. And same goes for its investments last year. 2/3 were into new gas. So, yeah.
So the Spanish government took this project on like in the last few weeks because Chile canceled the summit. Yeah. You are very critical of them turning to the biggest polluters to co-sponsor the event. How do you think something as large as this, tens of thousands of people coming into a community planned in the last few weeks, how could it be alternatively financed?
Yeah, I mean, I think we first have to go to who's actually financing it. Is it the corporations who've been approached? Because the Spanish president went to what's called the IBEX 35, the 35 biggest listed companies on the Spanish stock exchange, and begged them to sponsor, begged them for €2 million each. And in fact, what he did is he offered a 90% tax break to these companies. So it's not these corporations. In fact, it is the Spanish taxpayer who's paying for these talks, who's paying for the greenwashing and paying for the lobbying access. The way that needs to happen, in fact, is these companies need to, pay their taxes, would be a great start, but also we're seeing vulnerable communities across the world, those who did the least to contribute to this problem, suffering the consequences, and the companies that have caused it, rather than receiving tax breaks, rather than receiving huge fossil fuel subsidies, should be held liable for their actions and should be made to pay.
So right now here at the UN Climate Summit, do you see any improvements? I mean, the COP was held 3 times in Poland, which could be called coal land. And the last one, Katowice last year, that is the heart of coal land in Poland. The convention center where the climate summit was held was modeled on a coal mine.
Yeah.
Do you see any improvement?
What we do see is a bit more fear, shall we say. So here in Spain, what you've seen, all of these big dirty energy companies are pretending to be green. Endesa bought the front pages of pretty much every Spanish newspaper to claim that it was becoming a climate leader. But what we're not seeing is action. We're not seeing money on the table for countries and communities who need to face the consequences of climate change. We're not seeing real solutions. We're not seeing real ambition. So in fact, despite hundreds of thousands, millions of people out in the streets, it feels there's a huge disconnect between what people are demanding. People are demanding real solutions, and what our governments are doing, who keep listening to these same corporations. And this space, ultimately, it's a symptom of a bigger problem, because the problem lies at national level. In our national governments, our governments are in bed with these same corporations.
Here in Spain, the Spanish government gives fossil fuel electricity companies hundreds of millions of dollars and euros in subsidies to the companies. The International Monetary Fund estimates globally governments subsidize the fossil fuel industry to the tune of $5.2 trillion annually.
Yeah, I mean, that's massive.
What would that look like if that was subsidies given to wind, to solar, to biothermal?
This would pay for it that much a year. We're looking, of course, I mean, to pay for, if we had done this 10, 20 years ago, that would probably be enough. But what we're seeing now is the amount that's needed for communities and countries already facing typhoons, droughts, fires. That's already covering that figure. But if that figure went towards clean energy, went towards a real sort of renewable transformation, we could change our economic system. But unfortunately, our governments are not going to do so, because that's going to really impact the bottom lines of these same dirty energy companies.
Well, Pascal Sabido, I want to thank you so much for being with us. We'll be taking a toxic tour with you tomorrow. In 5 seconds, what does a toxic tour look like?
We're going to go around Madrid streets to the dirtiest companies involved in this COP, starting 1:15 at the Stock Exchange in Madrid. Join us.
And we'll bring you that next week. Pascal Sabido, researcher and campaigner for the Corporate Europe Observatory. And that does it for our show. We'll continue broadcasting from Madrid all next week at the UN Climate Summit, COP25. Tell your friends, spread the word. That does it for our show. Special thanks to our Democracy Now! Crew here in Madrid. John Hamilton, Dennis Moynihan, Trina Ndura, Libby Rainey, Laurie Gaddis, Dino Nermeen Sheikh, and to Miriam Barnard. I'm Amy Goodman. Thanks for joining us.